The coffee was still steaming at 5:47 a.m. when Dale Whitmer poured his first cup, 3 scoops of Folgers heated on the propane stove in the Ridgeway Ranch bunkhouse. He added 2 sugars, stared out the frosted window at the thermometer nailed to the fence post. 18 degrees below zero. The coldest February in Montana's recorded history. By 6:32 a.m., Dale would be the only man left standing. 10 others would be dead in the snow, and 1 more would bleed out before the ambulance arrived. This is the story of how a collapsed fence became 11 graves, and how 90 seconds of gunfire over 40 feet of disputed ground destroyed 2 families, shattered a community, and revealed the terrifying truth about what ordinary men become when pride meets desperation at the end of a rifle barrel. February 11, 1989, Madison County, Montana, a place where handshake deals still sealed cattle sales worth tens of thousands, where a man's word meant everything, and where neighbors settled differences face to face. Until they didn't. Until a 400-yard section of barbed wire collapsed under the weight of the worst winter in 50 years, and 2 ranchers, Tom Ridgeway, 52, third-generation cattleman facing foreclosure, and Carl Hollister, 44, oil rig veteran turned rancher fighting for his son's future, decided that property rights mattered more than human life. What happened in the frozen dawn between 6:31 and 6:32 a.m. that Saturday morning wasn't a shootout, it was an execution. Mutual combat between armed men who believed absolutely in their own righteousness, who couldn't see past 40 feet of snow-covered ground, who chose violence over compromise and turned a property line dispute into Madison County's deadliest mass shooting. 11 men shot, 10 dead within minutes, 1 survivor who would spend the rest of his life wishing he'd died with them. The Ridgeway Ranch had stood since 1947, when Tom's grandfather homesteaded 2,400 acres of high desert valley land between the Tobacco Root Mountains and the Gravelly Range. Tom inherited it in 1978, spent 11 years fighting to keep it profitable while beef prices collapsed and operating costs climbed. By February 1989, he owed $47,234 to First National Bank, due March 15th, 4 weeks away. The foreclosure notice had arrived February 3rd in an impersonal typewritten letter that reduced 3 generations of sweat and sacrifice to an account number in arrears. Tom's wife Margaret found him sitting at his desk an hour after reading it, hands clasped so tight his knuckles had gone white. "We can sell some cattle early," she'd said quietly. "The market's in the toilet," Tom had replied, not looking at her. "I'd lose money on every head and still need breeding stock for next year." That night, for the first time in their marriage, Tom slept in the guest room. Carl Hollister had bought his 800 acres in 1969 with money saved from 10 years working North Dakota oil rigs. Smaller operation, usually ran about 80% head, supplemented income with hay sales. He'd learned ranching the hard way, through mistakes and bad advice and stubborn determination. And even after 20 years, some old-timers still treated him like an outsider, a Billings City kid who didn't understand how things were done. His wife Linda had left him in 1982, took their daughter back to Billings, said she couldn't watch money drain away, while Carl insisted next year would be better. He had 2 sons, Roy, 19, broad-shouldered and hot-headed, who'd been working the ranch full-time since dropping out of high school at 16, and Michael, 17, quieter, who talked about maybe going to community college but knew his father needed him. By early February 1989, Carl had calculated he'd run out of winter hay by month's end unless the weather broke. He'd already borrowed $12,000 from his brother in Missoula. That money was gone. The bank wouldn't extend his line of credit. His hay supplier wanted cash up front. Carl Hollister was looking at losing everything he'd built over 20 years, and his sons' futures were slipping away with it. The fence had stood for 40 years, marking the property line between the ranches. 3 miles of 4-strand barbed wire stretched across hills and through draws, posts set in concrete, wire pulled tight. It had been built in 1949 by Tom's grandfather and the man who'd owned Carl's property before him. Montana law was clear. Adjoining landowners shared responsibility for partition fences, split the cost of maintenance and repair equally. For most of those 40 years, the arrangement had worked. But on January 28, 1989, at approximately 2:15 p.m., a 400-yard section collapsed. Sub-zero temperatures, high winds, and accumulated snow created perfect failure conditions. The fence line ran through a shallow draw where snow had drifted 15 feet deep against the wire. The weight combined with wind pressure snapped the wire in multiple places and toppled 8 fence posts. By the time anyone noticed, a quarter-mile gap had opened between the two properties. Tom discovered it during his afternoon check on January 29th, stood in the cold looking at the tangle of wire and broken posts, and felt something twist in his gut. In his mind, this was an act of God, nobody's fault, and the repair could wait until spring when the ground wasn't frozen solid. That was reasonable. That was practical. But by February 1st, 30 head of Ridgeway cattle had drifted through the gap onto Hollister land, following the contours of the draw to where Carl stored his winter hay. The cattle had gotten into 2 stacks, maybe 15 bales total, before Carl discovered them at dawn and drove them back through the gap with his son's help. Carl called the Ridgeway house that afternoon, February 2nd at 3:45 p.m. Margaret answered. "I need to talk to Tom. He's out checking cattle. Can I take a message? Tell him his cows got into my hay. Tell him that fence needs to be fixed now, not in spring." "Carl, you know Tom can't work fence in this cold. The ground's frozen." "I don't care about the ground. I care about my hay. You know what a bale costs right now? You know how tight margins are?" "We all know how tight margins are," Margaret said quietly. "Then tell your husband to keep his damn cattle on his own land." Tom returned the call that evening, 7:23 p.m. The conversation lasted 3 minutes and 20 seconds and ended with both men hanging up on each other. Tom said it was Carl's responsibility to fence out. That's Montana law, open range state. If you don't want somebody's cattle on your land, you fence them out. Carl said the fence was shared property and Tom was shirking his obligation. Neither man would budge. Over the next 8 days, the tension built like pressure in a sealed container. Tom's cattle continued to drift through the gap. Carl would drive them back, sometimes 3 times in a single day, wasting hours he should have spent on other work. His sons were furious. Roy especially talked about going over to the Ridgeway place and settling this. Carl told him to cool off, but the anger festered. On February 9th, Deputy James Mackenzie from the Madison County Sheriff's Office drove out to both ranches. He'd known both families for years, tried to mediate, suggested they could pool resources, split the cost of a temporary fix, just something to get through winter. Both men refused. Tom said it was Carl's responsibility to fence out. Carl said the fence was shared property and Tom was shirking his obligation. Mackenzie left feeling like he'd failed. He'd been a cop for 12 years, knew what pride looked like, knew what it could do. He'd write in his report later that he'd observed tension beyond normal neighbor disputes and that he'd feared potential for escalation. But there was nothing he could legally do. 2 men arguing about a fence wasn't a crime. On the evening of February 10th, Tom Ridgeway made his decision. He'd fix his half of the fence, clearly marked by what he believed were the original property survey stakes. He'd show Carl that he wasn't shirking anything. He called his foreman, Dale Whitmer, and told him to gather the crew. They'd head out at first light at the Hollister Ranch that same evening. Carl made his own decision. He'd been out to look at the collapsed section that afternoon, brought stakes and twine, marked off what he believed was the exact midpoint, the spot where Ridgeway responsibility ended and Hollister responsibility began. He told his sons they'd repair their half in the morning. He told them to bring tools. He didn't tell them to bring guns, but Roy loaded his 30-06 into the truck anyway. Just in case, he said. Neither man slept well that night. Both were thinking about money, about property, about respect. Neither man thought about killing anyone. Neither man thought about dying. February 11th, 4:31 a.m., Tom Ridgeway's alarm shrilled in the darkness. Margaret was already awake beside him. She'd barely slept. "Tom, please, just wait. Just one more day. Let me call Deputy Mackenzie. Let him try again." "It's handled, Margaret." He dressed in the dark, thermal underwear, jeans, flannel shirt, wool socks, work boots. Downstairs he made coffee, drank it standing at the sink while staring out the window at nothing. The thermometer read 12 below zero. Clear sky, no wind, the kind of morning where sound carried for miles. Dale Whitmer arrived at 5:15 a.m. with 4 other hands: Bobby Jensen, 28, Marcus Wright, 34, Pete Sullivan, 23, and old Harry Christensen, 59, who'd worked ranches his entire life. They loaded equipment into 2 trucks, post hole diggers, wire stretchers, fence pliers, a come-along, extra posts. Nobody talked much. It was just another day of work. At 5:47 a.m., Dale poured coffee from his thermos, steam rising in the frozen air. He stood by his truck watching Tom check and recheck the equipment. Something felt wrong. Dale couldn't name it, but it sat in his gut like cold stone. At 5:51 a.m., Tom climbed into his truck. They pulled out onto the county road, headlights cutting through darkness. 3 miles east, Carl Hollister's alarm had gone off at 4:45 a.m. His sons were already up, moving quietly in the cold house. They ate breakfast together, toast, eggs, coffee, and Carl looked at his boys across the table and felt a surge of fierce pride and desperate fear all mixed together. "We'll be done by noon," he said. "Get that fence up, get back to regular work." At 5:38 a.m., they loaded their truck, Carl, Roy, Michael, and 2 hired hands. Travis Kendrick, 26, and Sam Oakes, 31, both local men who needed the work. 5 men total. They brought posts and wire and tools and thermoses of coffee. In the gun rack behind the seat, Roy's 30-06 and Carl's old 12-gauge shotgun. Standard ranch equipment for dealing with coyotes or putting down injured cattle. At 6:04 a.m., they started driving west toward the collapsed fence section. 2 trucks heading toward each other through the frozen Montana darkness. 11 men with cold hands and empty stomachs and absolute certainty that they were in the right, the distance between them closing with every mile. At 6:23 a.m., Tom's truck crested a rise and he saw headlights in the distance moving on the same access road. His hands tightened on the wheel. "That's them," Dale said quietly. "I see them. Tom, maybe we should turn back. Come back later. We're not turning back." At 6:24 a.m., Carl saw the approaching headlights and felt his stomach drop. He'd hoped to arrive first, to be there working when Tom showed up, but they were arriving simultaneously, which meant confrontation. He kept driving. At 6:29 a.m., both trucks parked on opposite sides of the collapsed fence section, 50 yards apart. Men climbed out. Engines ticked in the cold. Breath fogged. Someone coughed. The fence line stretched between them, 300 yards of broken wire and toppled posts marked by 2 sets of stakes, 40 feet apart. Tom walked toward his stakes. Carl walked toward his. They stopped at their respective markers and turned to face each other across the morning darkness. "Those aren't the right stakes," Tom called out. "Yes, they are," Carl called back. "I measured from the original survey markers. Those markers are 40 years old. I'm going by the fence line itself, the posts my grandfather set." "Your grandfather's been dead 30 years, Tom. The law says we split this fence down the middle. And I'm telling you this," Tom pointed at his stake, "is the middle." The crews stood behind their respective bosses, holding tools, shuffling their feet, breath steaming. Dale Whitmer looked at the other men across the fence line. He recognized Travis Kendrick, had gone to high school with Travis's older brother. He recognized Sam Oakes from church. He saw Roy Hollister, just a kid really, with his father's stubborn jaw and angry eyes. This was wrong. This was so wrong. But Dale didn't know how to stop it. "I'm starting work at my marker," Tom said. "You want to work at yours, that's your business. But I'm not backing down. Neither am I." Both men turned back toward their trucks. Both reached for equipment. And somewhere in those movements, somewhere in the gathering light, someone's hand fell on metal that wasn't a fence post. The first shot echoed across the frozen valley at 6:31 a.m. Dale Whitmer was turning when he heard it. A flat crack that sounded wrong, too sharp, not the sound of tools but something else entirely. He saw Roy Hollister at the other truck, saw the rifle, saw the muzzle flash. He opened his mouth to shout something, a warning, a question, he'd never know. And then Bobby Jensen beside him made a sound like all the air had been punched from his lungs and fell. 3 seconds of confusion. 3 seconds where brains tried to process the impossible. 3 seconds where men stood frozen because fence work doesn't involve gunfire, neighbors don't shoot. Neighbors, this can't be happening. Then Tom Ridgeway moved. His Winchester came up from behind the truck seat and he fired across the fence line. The sound was enormous in the cold air. Somebody screamed. Dale couldn't tell who, couldn't tell which side. Everything was happening too fast. Carl Hollister was shouting something, no, 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 his hands up trying to stop it, but Roy had already worked the bolt and fired again. Pete Sullivan went down. Harry Christensen dropped his cigarette and dove behind the truck. Marcus Wright was running, trying to reach cover when a round caught him. He fell hard, tried to get up, couldn't. 8 seconds since the first shot, 3 men down, chaos spreading like fire. Dale pressed himself against the truck bed, his heart hammering so hard it hurt. He could hear Tom firing, methodical, deliberate, could hear answering fire from the Hollister side, could hear someone crying, someone cursing, someone praying. The sounds overlapped and separated and merged again into nightmare symphony. Roy Hollister was firing rapidly, panic firing, working the bolt as fast as he could. Sam Oakes had his own rifle out now and was shooting back. Travis Kendrick was on the ground crawling, trying to reach the other side of their truck. Michael Hollister was screaming for his father. Carl was trying to reach Roy, trying to pull him down, trying to stop this. 15 seconds since it started. The world had become muzzle flashes and echoes and the sharp smell of gunpowder. Tom Ridgeway fired again. His shot hit Travis Kendrick in the back as Travis crawled. The young man stopped moving. Tom worked the lever, ejected the brass, chambered another round. His face was set hard, showing nothing. He'd crossed into something else now, someplace where action replaced thought, where defense became offense, became killing. 23 seconds since it started. 6 men down, 3 on each side. The shooting continued. Carl Hollister had his shotgun now. He hadn't wanted to use it, hadn't wanted any of this. But his boy was shooting and men were dying and instinct took over. He fired both barrels toward the Ridgeway truck. The buckshot pattern spread wide at 50 yards. Some pellets hit metal, some hit flesh. Harry Christensen, hiding behind the truck, caught several pellets in his shoulder and arm. He screamed. Roy reloaded, his hands shaking, crying but still shooting because his father had taught him that you finished what you started, that you protected your family, that you never backed down. He fired at movement, fired at shadows, fired at the enemy that 5 minutes ago had been neighbors. Tom Ridgeway's Winchester clicked empty. He reached for the box of shells in the truck, reloading with practiced efficiency. 29 years of hunting had made this muscle memory. He didn't think, he just loaded, raised, aimed, fired. Each action separate, each target chosen, each trigger pull deliberate. 38 seconds since it started, 9 men down, only 2 still shooting, Tom and Roy. The others were dead, dying, wounded, or hiding. 1 minute since the first shot. This was the moment of choice. Tom Ridgeway could have stopped, could have lowered his rifle, could have called out to Carl, to Roy, could have ended this. 9 men were already down. That was horror enough. But Tom Ridgeway, standing behind his truck with brass shell casings at his feet and cordite smoke burning his throat, made a different choice. He saw movement at the Hollister truck, Carl reloading his shotgun, Roy working his bolt. And he chose to continue, chose to finish what had started, chose to defend his position until there was nothing left to defend against. There is no return from that choice. There is only what comes after. Roy Hollister fired again. The bullet punched through the Ridgeway truck's windshield, spiderwebbing the glass. Tom fired back. His shot hit the Hollister truck's hood. Roy ducked, came back up, fired again. The rhythm had become mechanical. Aim, shoot, work the bolt. Roy's face was streaked with tears and snot, and he was making sounds that weren't quite words anymore, just raw animal sounds of fear and rage and grief. Carl Hollister had reloaded his shotgun. He rose from behind the truck bed and fired. The pattern was wide, wild. Tom ducked, came up, fired back. The Winchester's bullet caught Carl in the chest. He fell backward, the shotgun clattering from his hands. "Dad!" Michael Hollister had been hiding under the truck. He crawled out now, tried to reach his father. "Dad, no. No, please." Roy saw his father fall, saw his younger brother exposed. Something inside Roy broke. He stepped out from behind the truck, no cover now, just standing in the open, and fired at Tom Ridgeway with everything he had left. 1 shot, 2, 3, working the bolt, not aiming, just firing, just rage and grief made into lead and powder. Tom took 1 round in the shoulder, spun, went down on 1 knee, raised the Winchester one-handed, fired. The shot took Roy in the throat. The young man dropped his rifle, clutched at his neck, fell to his knees, then onto his side. 54 seconds since it started. 11 men shot, most dead or dying. The shooting slowed, stopped, became silence. Sam Oakes was still alive, huddled behind the Hollister truck's wheel well, bleeding from his leg. He had his rifle but had stopped shooting when Carl went down. He was just trying to breathe, trying to stay conscious, trying to understand how a Saturday morning fence repair had become this. Michael Hollister was crying over his father's body. Carl was still breathing, short, wet, terrible breaths, but his eyes were glassy and unfocused. Blood stained the snow beneath him. Michael pressed his hands against his father's chest, trying to stop the bleeding, crying, "Dad, please, please stay with me." Tom Ridgeway sat on the ground beside his truck, his left shoulder on fire, his right hand still holding the Winchester. He looked at the collapsed fence section, at the bodies scattered around it, at the blood on the snow. The sun was fully up now. Everything was very clear and very bright. Dale Whitmer climbed out of the truck cab, moving slowly, hands visible. He looked at Tom. Tom looked back. Neither spoke. What words existed for this? 1 minute and 7 seconds from first shot to last shot. 11 men shot. 10 dead or dying within the hour. 1 wounded survivor who would never be whole again. And 2 men, Tom and Dale, sitting in the snow surrounded by what they'd done. Dale stood up slowly, his legs shaking. "Tom," he said, his voice sounding strange, distant. "Tom, we need to get help." "Get to the truck," Tom said, his voice flat, empty. "Drive to the ranch, call the sheriff, you need a hospital. Do what I said." Dale climbed into Tom's truck, the windshield shattered but functional enough to see through. He started the engine. It caught on the first try. That reliable Ford engine, like everything was normal, like the world hadn't just ended. He put it in gear and drove away, leaving Tom Ridgeway sitting alone with what he'd done. The silence after was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of a graveyard, the silence of absence where voices had been, the silence of snow absorbing blood and birds that had stopped singing and wind that carried the smell of gunpowder and death. Tom Ridgeway sat against his truck's tire, his shoulder screaming pain, his rifle across his lap, looking at 11 lives ended over a fence, over property lines and pride, and a winter that had driven everyone to desperation. Deputy James Mackenzie's patrol car crested the rise at 7:52 a.m., and he saw the scene below, 2 trucks, bodies scattered like fallen scarecrows, a young man standing alone in the center of the carnage, another man sitting against a tire. He stopped his car 50 yards out, got out slowly, his hand near his weapon but not drawing it. "This is the Madison County Sheriff," he called out. "Nobody move." Neither Tom nor Michael moved. Mackenzie approached carefully, his training warring with the sheer impossibility of what he was seeing. 10 men down, blood in the snow, shell casings glinting in the morning sun, the smell of death already settling over the scene despite the cold. He'd been here 2 days ago, had tried to mediate this dispute, had felt it building, and he'd failed to stop it. He reached Michael first, the boy covered in Carl Hollister's blood but physically uninjured. "Son," Mackenzie said gently, "what's your name?" "Michael." The voice was flat, mechanical. "Michael Hollister, are you hurt?" "No, I need you to come with me. Can you walk?" Michael nodded, followed when Mackenzie led him to the patrol car, sat in the back seat without protest. Mackenzie approached Tom next. "Mr. Ridgeway, I need you to put down any weapons." Tom gestured weakly at the Winchester lying in the snow 10 feet away. "Already down. You're wounded. I need to get you to a hospital. Check the others first. Some might still—" But Tom stopped. He knew that wasn't true, knew from the stillness, knew from the silence. Mackenzie helped Tom to his feet, walked him to the patrol car. Tom sat in the front passenger seat, his left shoulder dark with blood, his face showing nothing. In the back seat, Michael stared at nothing. Mackenzie picked up his radio, Unit 3 to dispatch. "I have 2 survivors in custody, 1 wounded. Confirming 10 DOA at scene. Repeat, 10 dead on arrival. Need coroner. Need state police. Need crime scene unit. This is—" his voice cracked. "This is the worst thing I've ever seen." At the fence line, 10 bodies lay in the snow. The sun was bright, the day was clear. The fence was still collapsed. Stakes marking disputed ground that no longer mattered. The wire and posts sat unused, tools scattered where they'd been dropped. Somewhere, families were waking up, making plans, living Saturday morning, thinking about groceries and chores, and what to make for dinner. They didn't know yet. In 4 hours, the entire region would know. But first, someone had to tell them. First, someone had to knock on doors and destroy worlds with words. The Montana Snowfield killings had taken 90 seconds to execute. They would take decades to understand. And the fence that started it all would never be repaired. Tom Ridgeway was convicted of 7 counts of second-degree murder and 3 counts of voluntary manslaughter in September 1989. Judge Patricia Thornton sentenced him to 7 consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole for 140 years. He died in Montana State Prison on March 17, 2023, at age 86, having served 34 years. No family attended his burial. Margaret Ridgeway never remarried, sold the ranch to pay legal fees and victim settlements, died in 2011 from cancer. Her last words to her daughter, "Tell your father I understand why he did it. Tell him I never stopped loving him, but tell him I can't forgive him either." The message was never delivered. Dale Whitmer quit ranching, moved to Billings, worked construction, drank too much, died in 2015 from cirrhosis. His last recorded words about the shooting, in a 2008 interview, Tom was defending what was his. Carl was defending what was his. They were both right, they were both wrong, and 10 men died because neither one could back down. Michael Hollister disappeared from public record after 1989. Last confirmed sighting was in Spokane, Washington, in 2007, working as a night janitor. He'd be 53 now. Whether he's still alive, whether he ever found peace, no one knows. The Ridgeway Ranch was sold in 1990 to a California developer for $340,000, subdivided into 40 20-acre ranchettes. The Hollister property met the same fate, sold in 1991, developed into Madison Valley Estates. The ranch house where Carl and his sons ate breakfast together was demolished in 1994. A 5-bedroom mansion with a 4-car garage sits on that foundation now. The current owners, a retired tech executive from Seattle and his wife, don't know what happened there. Don't know that 3 men who lived on that land died over a fence line. The fence that started it all was removed entirely in 1990. The collapsed section, the disputed stakes, the posts and wire that 10 men died over, all torn out. The property line was surveyed professionally, marked with steel pins set in concrete, and forgotten. The exact spot where the shooting occurred is unmarked. No memorial, no plaque, no indication that anything significant ever happened there. It's part of someone's back 40 now, probably used for horses or left wild for aesthetics. The snow that fell that February morning has melted and frozen and melted again 10,000 times. The grass has grown over the blood, but locals know. They don't talk about it with outsiders, don't mention it to the new residents, but they know. When they drive past on the county road, they look away. 36 years later, the question remains, was Tom Ridgeway a murderer? Yes. The law said so. The jury said so. The evidence said so. Was he a desperate father protecting his family's legacy, a man watching 3 generations of work disappear, a man who believed genuinely that he had the legal right to defend his property? Also yes. Both can be true simultaneously. That's the most disturbing part, because the question isn't whether Tom Ridgeway was guilty. He was. The question is, what would you have done in his place? How far would you go to protect your family? When the system fails, when the bank won't extend credit, when the neighbor won't compromise, when pride and property become indistinguishable from survival, where does defense end and murder begin? When does desperation become justification for horror? Tom Ridgeway didn't wake up on February 11, 1989, planning to kill 10 men. He woke up planning to fix a fence, to defend his property, to prove he wasn't beaten yet. But somewhere in the frozen morning, in the confrontation at disputed stakes, choice became action, became massacre. Monsters aren't born. They're made. One foreclosure notice at a time, one humiliation at a time, one moment of choosing property over compromise at a time. Each of us is closer to that line than we'd like to admit. Each of us has breaking points we haven't tested. Each of us has principles we defend until we discover what defense actually costs. That should terrify us. You can condemn Tom Ridgeway. You should condemn Tom Ridgeway. 10 men died by his hand or his order. That's murder by any reasonable definition. But can you honestly say you'd never understand? That you'd never, in any circumstance, could imagine crossing that line? That pride and property and family and desperation could never combine into something you'd regret but couldn't prevent? If you say no, if you say you'd never, then you're lying to yourself. We're all liars about what we're capable of until we're tested. The Montana Snowfield killings aren't history, they're prophecy, they're warning, they're mirror. And the fence that divided those men still divides us, between who we think we are and who we become when everything we've built is slipping away, and the only choice left is to stand our ground or lose it all.